What if the biggest mistake of your life is not the wrong step you took, but the right step you never took because you couldn't see where it would lead? Most people are waiting for the perfect moment, waiting for the guaranteed outcome, waiting until the fear goes away, but the fear never goes away, and the moment never arrives. There is a man in history who faced exactly this choice and made a decision so radical, so unreasonable, so completely against everything logic would suggest, that it changed the course of human civilization forever. He wasn't young, he wasn't fearless, he didn't have a map, a plan, or any guarantee that what he was walking toward even existed. He had one thing, and it turns out that one thing is the only thing that has ever moved anyone from the life they have to the life they were meant to live. Before we go any further, if you have ever felt stuck, paralyzed, or afraid to move because you couldn't see what was waiting on the other side, leave a T. Comment right now, just say, "I'm waiting" or "I'm ready," because this video was made for exactly that moment, and I want to know you're here. If this is already hitting something real in you, hit the like button, not for the algorithm, but as a declaration to yourself that you are done waiting for certainty before you move. And if you have never subscribed to this channel, this is the moment. Every single video here exists for one reason: to take the wisdom of the greatest minds in history and use it to transform the way you think, decide, and live. Now, let's talk about the man who changed everything by doing the one thing most people never do. His name was Abram. And when this story begins, he was not young, not desperate, and not searching for a way out. He was 75 years old, settled, respected, living in Ur, one of the most sophisticated cities in the ancient world, with running water, advanced mathematics, and a social structure that most people would spend their entire lives trying to reach. He had a home, a family, a name that meant something, and in a world where identity was everything, where you were your land, your tribe, your ancestors, he had all three. This is the detail that most people miss when they hear this story. We imagine Abraham as someone with nothing to lose, but the truth is the complete opposite. He had everything that the ancient world defined as a good life. And that is exactly what makes what happened next so radical, so unreasonable, so deeply human, because the call didn't come to someone at rock bottom. It didn't come to someone desperate for a way out. It came to someone comfortable, someone stable, someone who had every logical reason to stay exactly where he was. And if you have ever felt the pull toward something bigger while standing in the middle of a life that looks perfectly fine from the outside, you already know exactly how that feels. If this is speaking to something inside you right now, drop the word "ready" in the comments, just that one word. You'll understand why later. Then came the voice, and what it said defied every rule of logic, every instinct of self-preservation, and every principle of rational decision-making that human beings have followed since the beginning of civilization. Leave your country, leave your people, leave your father's household. No destination, no timeline, no explanation of what would be waiting on the other side. Just a direction and a promise so large it was almost impossible to hold in the mind of a single person standing in the middle of an ordinary day. And here is what nobody talks about when they tell this story. Abraham didn't receive a map. He didn't receive a detailed plan. He didn't receive a guarantee that could be verified, measured, or proven to anyone who asked. The ancient text is brutally honest about this. He went out not knowing where he was going. Those words are preserved exactly as they are because they are the most important words in the entire story. Not knowing where he was going. Think about what that actually means. In a world without GPS, without infrastructure, without the ability to call ahead or look it up or ask someone who had made the trip before. In a world where leaving your tribe was one of the most dangerous things a human being could do. in a world where your survival was directly tied to your roots. He untied himself from everything that had ever kept him alive, and he moved, not because he could see the destination, but because something inside him recognized the voice and understood at a level deeper than logic that staying would cost him something far greater than leaving ever could. This is the moment that separates the people who transform their lives from the people who spend their entire lives waiting for the right moment to begin. It is not intelligence, it is not resources, it is not talent or timing or perfect circumstances. It is the willingness to move before you can see where you are going. And if you have ever stood at the edge of a decision that scared you, not because it was wrong, but because you couldn't see far enough ahead to be sure it was right, drop "I hear it" in the comments right now, because you have heard that voice too. And this story is about what happens when you finally decide to answer it. But let's stop here for a moment, because before we follow Abraham into the desert, we need to understand something that the version of this story you were probably told left out completely. Leaving was not a single dramatic moment. It was not one heroic decision made in a burst of divine inspiration that carried him effortlessly from one life into another. The actual cost of what Abraham did was paid slowly, quietly, and in ways that no sermon, no painting, and no children's Bible has ever fully captured. Think about what he was leaving behind at a level deeper than geography. He was leaving his language, the specific sounds and rhythms of a place that had shaped every thought he had ever formed. He was leaving the faces of people who had known him long enough to remember who he was before he became who he was. He was leaving the version of himself that existed only in relation to that land, that community, that name. Because identity in the ancient world was not something you carried inside you like we imagine today. It was something that existed between you and the people who knew you. It was relational. It was rooted. It was inseparable from the ground beneath your feet. When Abraham left Ur, he didn't just leave a city. He left the version of himself that city had made possible. And this is where the story stops being ancient history and starts being the most personal thing you have ever heard. Because most of us are not afraid of the destination. We are afraid of losing the version of ourselves that exists in the place we are leaving. The version that people recognize, the version that has a track record, a reputation, a role that everyone understands. The version that knows how to navigate the environment it is already in. Starting over doesn't just mean starting somewhere new. It means becoming someone who has not yet been proven, someone who has no track record in this new territory, someone who has to rebuild not just their life, but their identity. And that is a cost that almost no one talks about, because it is invisible. It doesn't show up on a balance sheet or a risk assessment, but it is the real reason most people stay. Not because they don't want the destination, but because they are not ready to let go of the self they would have to leave behind to get there. Abraham paid that cost, fully, without negotiation. And the question that this part of the story leaves hanging in the air, the question you're going to have to sit with for a moment before we continue, is this: what version of yourself are you protecting right now that is actually preventing you from becoming who you are supposed to? Drop "I know who" in the comments if that question just hit something real, because the next part of this story is going to show you exactly what happens on the other side of that answer. Here is where most people expect the story to accelerate. Abraham left everything, so now the blessings pour in. The path clears, the promise unfolds. The universe rewards the courage with immediate confirmation that the decision was right. That is not what happened. What happened first was Canaan, a land already occupied by other people. A land of famine so severe that Abraham couldn't stay there and had to keep moving into Egypt just to survive. a land that looked nothing like the promise he had been given. And if you have ever made a massive leap of faith, left the job, ended the relationship, started the business, made the move, and then looked around at your new reality and thought, this is not what I was promised, then you understand exactly what Abraham was feeling, standing in Canaan for the first time. This is the gap that destroys most people's transformations before they ever have a chance to take root. The gap between the decision and the manifestation, between the step and the destination, between the moment you leave and the moment you arrive. And it is inside this gap, this uncomfortable, disorienting, faith-testing space where the real work of transformation actually happens. Because transformation is never an event. It is never the moment you make the decision, announce the change, or take the first step. Transformation is what happens in the long, quiet, unglamorous middle, the part nobody posts about, the part that doesn't make it into the highlight reel, the part where you are no longer who you were, but have not yet become who you are going to be. Abraham lived in that gap for years, decades, moving through a land that was promised to him but not yet given, building altars, not monuments to success, but markers of presence, small acts of faithfulness in the middle of a journey that had not yet produced the thing he was promised. And this is the ancient wisdom that the Stoics, the philosophers, and every transformational tradition in human history has been trying to communicate in different ways for thousands of years. The quality of your life is not determined by your destination. It is determined by who you become in the space between where you started and where you are going. The gap is not the obstacle. The gap is the curriculum. Every uncomfortable day in that in-between space is not evidence that you made the wrong decision. It is evidence that the transformation is working, that something is being built inside you that could not have been built any other way. That the version of you who will eventually receive what was promised is being forged right now in exactly the difficulty you are currently experiencing. Abraham didn't know this when he was in it. He couldn't see the end from the middle any more than you can see yours right now, but he kept moving. He kept building altars. He kept showing up in the gap. And if you are in that gap right now, if you have made the leap and the landing hasn't happened yet and everything around you looks more like famine than promise, drop "I'm in the gap" in the comments, because what comes next in this story is going to be exactly what you need to hear. There is a moment in every great transformation where the person in the middle of it makes a mistake. Not a small mistake, not a momentary lapse in judgment that can be quietly corrected and forgotten, a real mistake, the kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about yourself, the kind that forces you to confront the gap between who you are trying to become and who you still are underneath the intention. For Abraham, that moment came in Egypt. The famine had pushed him south. He was vulnerable, displaced, and operating in a foreign environment where the rules were different, and his usual points of reference were gone. And in that vulnerability, he did something that the story preserves with uncomfortable honesty. He lied. He told the Egyptians that Sarah was his sister, not his wife, because he was afraid that her beauty would get him killed. He chose self-preservation over truth. He chose fear over integrity. He compromised the person he was supposed to be protecting in order to protect himself. And it worked. In the short term, it worked perfectly. Pharaoh treated him well because of Sarah. Abraham received sheep, cattle, donkeys, camels, and servants. By every external measure, the deception was a success. But something happened that Abraham did not plan for. God intervened. Pharaoh discovered the truth, and Abraham, the man called to be the father of a new way of living, was escorted out of Egypt by the most powerful ruler in the known world, exposed and humiliated, carrying everything he had gained through compromise. This is the moment most people quietly skip over when they tell the story of Abraham, Because it is deeply uncomfortable. Because it forces us to hold two things at the same time that we desperately want to separate. That a person can be genuinely called to something extraordinary and still fail in the middle of the process. That faith and fear can exist in the same heart at the same time. That the person God chooses to transform the world is still in the middle of that transformation, capable of making the same decisions, driven by the same fears as everyone else. And this matters more than almost anything else in this entire story, because one of the most destructive lies that the self-improvement industry, the motivational world, and even religious tradition tells us about transformation is that once you commit to the path, the old patterns disappear. That the decision to change is the same as the change itself. That real faith produces perfect behavior. Abraham's story says something completely different. It says that the path of transformation is walked by imperfect people making imperfect decisions in the middle of a process they cannot fully see or control. It says that failure in the middle of the journey is not evidence that you are the wrong person for the journey. It is evidence that you are human and that the transformation is still working, not despite your failures, but often through them. Because what came out of Egypt with Abraham was not just livestock and servants. What came out of Egypt was a man who had seen himself clearly, who had felt the specific shame of compromising his integrity under pressure, who now knew, in a way that no amount of inspiration or teaching could have produced, exactly where his weakest point was. And that knowledge, that painful, humiliating, self-revealing knowledge is worth more to the process of genuine transformation than 1,000 moments of flawless performance. The Stoics called this the practice of self-examination. Marcus Aurelius wrote about it. Every single morning, not to celebrate his strengths, but to confront his failures with honesty and without self-destruction. Epictetus taught that the obstacle is the material of transformation, that what breaks you open is the same thing that makes you larger. Abraham didn't know he was practicing Stoicism, but he was living its deepest principle in real time. He failed. He saw himself clearly. He kept going, and if you have ever made a decision in fear that contradicted your values, if you have ever compromised something important because the pressure was too high and the vulnerability too real, drop "I've been there" in the comments. Because the next part of this story is about what happens when a person who has seen their own weakness clearly decides to keep walking anyway. And then God asked for everything back. Not the land, not the livestock, not the years of waiting or the decades of wandering or the accumulated cost of a life lived in permanent uncertainty. Those things Abraham had already surrendered one by one across the long architecture of a journey that had asked more of him than any reasonable person would have agreed to at the beginning. God asked for Isaac, the son, the only son, the child born when Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, the child who was biologically impossible, scientifically absurd, and yet undeniably real, laughing and growing and carrying inside his small body the entire future that had been promised. Isaac was not just Abraham's son. Isaac was the proof. The evidence that the voice had been real, the promise had been true, the decades of waiting had meant something. Isaac was the answer to every year Abraham had spent in the gap, wondering if he had heard correctly. And now the voice that had given him Isaac was asking him to give Isaac back. There is no theological explanation that makes this comfortable. There is no philosophical framework that makes this easy to hold. And I think the story knows that. I think the story preserves the full weight of this moment without softening it precisely, because softening it would destroy the only thing that makes it transformational. Because what Abraham was being asked to surrender in that moment was not just his son. He was being asked to surrender his understanding of how the promise was supposed to work. He was being asked to release his grip on the specific outcome he had decided was the only possible way the story could end well. He was being asked to trust the voice more than he trusted his own map of how everything was supposed to unfold. And this is where the story leaves the ancient world entirely and walks directly into the center of your life right now, because most of us are not holding on to a child. But we are holding on to something, a specific version of how our transformation is supposed to look. A particular relationship that we have decided is the only one that can make us whole. A career path that has become so identified with our sense of purpose that we cannot imagine the purpose surviving without it. A dream that has slowly, quietly shifted from being something we are pursuing to being something we are protecting, because somewhere along the way we confused the dream with the dreamer. And the deepest wisdom in this entire story, the wisdom that every Stoic philosopher, every transformational teacher, every person who has ever genuinely changed their life at the deepest level has eventually arrived at, is this: you cannot fully receive what you are not willing to fully release. The thing you are gripping most tightly right now is almost certainly the thing that is preventing the next level of your transformation from arriving. Not because holding on is wrong, but because the version of you that is gripping it is not yet the version of you that is ready to carry what comes next. Abraham walked up that mountain carrying everything he had ever been promised, and he was willing to lay it down, not because he had stopped caring, not because it didn't matter, but because he had learned across decades of walking with a voice he could not see, through failures he could not predict, through gaps he could not measure, that the voice was more trustworthy than his own understanding of how the story was supposed to end. That is not blind faith. That is the most sophisticated form of wisdom that a human being can develop. It is the wisdom that comes only from a long history of being wrong about your own predictions and discovering that what actually happened was better than what you had planned. And if there is something you are holding right now that you already know, somewhere beneath the noise of your daily life, you are going to have to release before the next chapter can begin. Drop "I know what it is" in the comments. You don't have to name it. Just acknowledge it. Because the next part of this story is going to show you exactly what happens on the other side of that release. Abraham raised the knife. Let that land for a moment. He didn't hesitate at the base of the mountain. He didn't stop halfway up. He didn't build the altar and then stand beside it, hoping something would intervene before it came to that. He went all the way. He laid his son on the altar. He raised the knife. And in that specific moment, the moment of total surrender, the moment of complete release, the moment where every last trace of self-protection and personal agenda had finally been emptied out, the provision appeared. Not before, not when he made the decision to go, not when he told his servants to wait at the bottom of the mountain, not when he built the altar, not even when he laid Isaac down. After. The ram appeared after the knife was raised. And I need you to understand why the timing of this moment is the most important detail in the entire story. Because it is not a detail. It is the architecture of how transformation actually works. It is the principle that every person who has ever made a genuine leap of faith in their career, their relationships, their calling, their life, has discovered the hard way in real time with their own version of a knife raised over their own version of everything they held most dear. The provision never comes before the surrender is complete. This is not cruelty. This is not a test designed to cause maximum pain before delivering minimum relief. This is the precise and necessary mechanics of how a human being is transformed from someone who trusts the process when it is comfortable into someone who trusts the process when it costs everything, because partial surrender produces partial transformation. Because the version of you that holds something back, that goes to the altar but keeps one hand on the thing being offered, is not yet the version of you that can carry what comes next. The ram in the thicket was always there. The provision was already present before Abraham reached the top of the mountain. But it could only become visible, it could only become accessible at the precise moment when Abraham's hands were completely empty of everything he had been holding. Think about what this means for the area of your life where you are waiting for provision right now. Think about the thing you are asking for, praying for, working toward, hoping will arrive. And then ask yourself honestly, with the specific honesty that this story demands, whether your hands are actually empty, whether you have actually released the outcome, whether you are truly open to receiving what is coming, or whether you are still gripping so tightly to your version of how it should arrive that you would not recognize it if it came in a different form than the one you expected. Because this is the hidden mechanism behind almost every story of genuine transformation that has ever been recorded. The breakthrough does not come before the release. It comes after, sometimes immediately after, like the ram in the thicket. Sometimes weeks, months, or years after, but always after. Always on the other side of the moment when you finally stop trying to control the outcome and trust the voice that called you to begin with. The Stoics understood this principle in their own language. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the discipline of desire, the practice of wanting only what is within your control and releasing everything that is not. Epictetus taught his students that the moment you stop treating external outcomes as requirements for your peace, you become genuinely free for the first time. Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, that the thing we are gripping in terror is almost never as fragile as our fear tells us it is. Abraham didn't know he was practicing Stoic philosophy on top of that mountain, but he was living its highest expression. He had arrived at the place where his inner freedom was no longer dependent on any external outcome, not even the life of the person he loved most in the world. And it was from that place, that completely empty, completely surrendered, completely free place, that the provision appeared. The ram was in the thicket the whole time, waiting for the moment when Abraham's hands were finally open enough to receive it. And the question that I want you to carry into the next part of this story, the question that I believe is the most important one you will hear today, is this: what has been waiting in your thicket, already present, already prepared, that you have not yet been able to see because your hands have not yet been fully open? Drop "my hands are open" in the comments if something just shifted inside you, because what comes next is going to show you exactly what Abraham discovered on the other side of that mountain, and why it changed not just his life, but the lives of every person who would come after him for the next 4,000 years. Abraham came down from that mountain a different man than the one who had walked up it, not because of what he had received, but because of what he had proven, not to God, not to Isaac, not to the servants waiting at the bottom, but to himself. He had discovered, in the most visceral and irreversible way that a human being can discover anything, that he was capable of complete surrender, that his love for the voice was deeper than his love for the outcome, that his trust in the process was stronger than his terror of the loss. And that knowledge, that specific, embodied, hard-won knowledge, is the kind that cannot be taught in a classroom, read in a book, or absorbed from someone else's story. It can only be earned on your own mountain, with your own knife raised, over your own version of everything you hold most dear. And here is where the story stops being about Abraham entirely and becomes completely about you. Because the transformation that Abraham experienced on that mountain is not reserved for ancient patriarchs in a world that no longer exists. It is the same transformation that is available to every human being who is willing to walk the same path, not the geographical path through the ancient Middle East, but the internal path that every great tradition, every genuine philosophy, every real story of human change has been pointing toward since the beginning of recorded history. The path of releasing what you cannot control in order to receive what you cannot yet imagine. This is what the Stoics called the inner citadel, the place inside you that no external circumstance can reach or destroy. The place that Marcus Aurelius protected every morning with his writing, the place that Epictetus found even in slavery, the place that Seneca described as the only real freedom a human being can possess. It is the place you arrive at not by building walls around yourself, but by releasing your grip on everything outside yourself, until what remains is something so solid, so unshakable, so genuinely yours that no famine, no failure, no loss, and no mountain can take it from you. Abraham found that place. And what happened next, what flowed out of that place in the years that followed, was not just personal transformation. It was generational transformation. It was the kind of change that does not stop with one person, but moves through families, communities, and centuries, touching lives that the original person never met and could never have imagined. Because this is the part of transformation that nobody talks about in the self-improvement world. We talk about personal breakthroughs, personal success, personal freedom, personal achievement, and all of those things matter, but the deepest transformations, the ones that actually change the world rather than just changing one life, are always the ones that overflow, that cannot be contained within a single person, that produce something so abundant, so genuinely new, that it becomes a resource for everyone who comes into contact with the person who was transformed. Abraham's willingness to surrender everything produced a legacy that 4,000 years later is still shaping the lives of billions of people across 3 of the world's major religions. Not because he was perfect, not because he never failed, not because his journey was clean or linear or free from compromise and fear and long stretches of painful waiting, but because he kept walking, he kept surrendering, he kept showing up at the altar with open hands, even when everything in him wanted to grip tighter. And the transformation that produced that legacy is available to you right now, in the exact circumstances you are currently living, with the exact resources you currently have, from the exact place you are currently standing. You do not need to be younger. You do not need to be further along. You do not need to have made better decisions in the past or have a cleaner track record or a more impressive starting point. Abraham was 75 years old, living in a city that no longer exists, carrying a promise he could not verify. And he changed the world. The only question that has ever mattered in any story of genuine transformation is whether you are willing to take the next step without being able to see the one after it. And if something in you is saying yes, if something beneath the noise and the fear and the accumulated weight of everything that has kept you standing still is beginning to move, drop "I'm ready to move" in the comments right now. Because the final part of this story is going to give you the one thing you need to actually do it. Here is what nobody tells you about the end of Abraham's story. There is no arrival scene. There is no moment where he stands on a hill, looks out over everything that was promised, and says, "Finally, it is done. I have arrived. The journey is complete, and I can rest now in the fullness of everything I was told was coming." That moment never happens, not in his lifetime. Abraham died still holding the promise. Still, living as a stranger in the land that had been given to him, still waiting for the full manifestation of everything the voice had described on that first day in Ur, when a 75-year-old man looked up from a comfortable life and heard something that would cost him everything and give him something greater than everything in return. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is deeply uncomfortable. And because it is the most honest and the most important thing this entire story has to say to you. The transformation is not a destination. It is not a finish line you cross, after which everything becomes permanently easier, permanently clearer, permanently free from uncertainty and loss, and the specific ache of holding a promise that has not yet fully arrived. The transformation is the journey itself. It is the person you become in the process of walking towards something you cannot yet see. It is the character that is forged in the gap, on the mountain, in the middle of the failure, in the long, quiet years of faithful presence in a land that still belongs to someone else. Abraham never stopped being a pilgrim. He never stopped being someone in the middle of a process. And that is not the tragic ending to his story. That is the glory of it, because what he left behind was not a completed destination. It was a demonstrated path, a living proof that a human being can walk through an entire lifetime of uncertainty, failure, surrender, waiting, and loss, and emerge not destroyed but enlarged, not emptied but deepened, not defeated by what was not yet given, but transformed by the faithfulness required to keep walking toward it. This is the wisdom that the Stoics spent their entire lives trying to articulate. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journal every single morning, not because he had arrived at wisdom, but because wisdom was something he had to actively choose every day in the middle of an imperfect life that kept presenting him with new reasons to abandon it. Epictetus taught from a position of lived experience, not theoretical knowledge, because he understood that the only philosophy worth anything is the one that holds when everything falls apart. Seneca wrote about the shortness of life not to produce despair, but to produce urgency. The specific urgency of a person who understands that the transformation available to them is not waiting for better circumstances. It is available now, in this moment, with this life, exactly as it is. And so we arrive at the only place this story was ever trying to take you, not to information about an ancient man in a world that no longer exists, but to a question that is as alive and as urgent and as personal as the next decision you are going to make after this video ends. What is the voice saying to you right now that you have been afraid to follow because you cannot see where it leads? Not the voice of ambition, not the voice of ego or comparison, or the desperate need to prove something to someone who doubted you, the deeper voice, the quieter one, the one that has been saying the same thing for months or years or decades, beneath the noise of your daily life, beneath the opinions of people who have never been called to what you are being called to, beneath the accumulated weight of every time you started and stopped and told yourself it wasn't the right moment yet. That voice is not going to get louder. It is not going to provide more evidence. It is not going to wait indefinitely while you gather enough certainty to feel safe moving forward. It has already said what it came to say. The question is not whether you heard it. You heard it. The question is whether you are going to answer it. Abraham answered it at 75 years old, with no map, no guarantee, and no way of knowing that 4,000 years later, his story would still be transforming the lives of people in a world so different from his that he could not have imagined a single detail of it. He answered it with nothing but a willingness to move before he could see. And that willingness, that single, terrifying, life-defining willingness, changed everything. You are watching this video for a reason, not by accident, not by coincidence. You are watching it because something in you is ready, or almost ready, or fighting with everything it has against being ready, to take a step that your current version of yourself cannot yet fully justify. Take it anyway. Not because you are certain, not because the fear is gone, not because you can see the destination or the provision or the ram in the thicket that is already waiting for you on the other side of your surrender. Take it because the version of you that takes that step, imperfect, afraid, uncertain, and moving anyway, is already more free than the version of you that waits for certainty that will never come. Abraham left everything without knowing where he was going, and he changed the world. You do not need to change the world. You just need to change your life. And your life changes the moment you decide that the voice is worth following. Not because you can prove it, but because something deeper than proof is telling you it is true. If this story has changed something in you today, if something shifted between the beginning of this video and right now, leave a comment that says, "I will move," not as a promise to anyone watching, as a declaration to yourself, because the research is clear and the ancient wisdom confirms it. The moment you articulate a commitment out loud, something in your brain begins treating it as real. The declaration is the first step. The first step is the beginning of everything. Subscribe to this channel. Not because of the algorithm, not because of the numbers, but because every single video here exists for one reason: to take the wisdom of the greatest minds and the most transformational stories in human history and use them to help you become the person you were always meant to be. New video every day. Ancient wisdom, real transformation for people who are ready to move. This is the Academy of Masters of the Mind, and you were always meant to be here.